Ladies and gentlemen, in more than 30 years on the bench, I have learned that a courtroom is not merely a room filled with laws and procedures. It is a place where human stories collide with legal boundaries. And one morning, a case came before me that seemed ordinary on paper, but would ultimately challenge everything I believed about guilt and justice. The file described financial misconduct, nearly $50,000 transferred from a small, family-owned business into a personal account over a period of months. Documentation carefully organized, signatures verified, numbers precise and unforgiving. The prosecution prepared to argue intent and breach of trust, the employer present and visibly wounded by betrayal, and the defendant standing before me looking less like a criminal mastermind and more like a man who had not slept in weeks, shoulders heavy, eyes hollow, and when I asked him how he pleaded, there was a hesitation that spoke louder than words, and before he could answer, his wife, seated quietly behind him, whispered through tears that he was not guilty. A breach of courtroom etiquette that normally would have required correction, yet something in her voice carried not defiance, but desperation. And I allowed her to approach, because sometimes justice requires listening beyond protocol. She explained that she had been diagnosed with a life-threatening condition, that the surgery required to save her life demanded immediate payment, that they had no insurance, no savings, no relatives able to assist, that loan applications had been denied, and that each day of delay reduced her chances of survival. And as she spoke, the courtroom shifted from a space of accusation to one of uncomfortable reflection. Because while the law is structured around statutes and precedents, life rarely unfolds in neat paragraphs, and the prosecutor rightfully reminded the court that hardship does not grant permission to violate trust, that an employer's confidence had been betrayed, that theft is theft regardless of motive, and he was correct. Because if the law bends too easily, it loses credibility. Yet as I reviewed the hospital invoices, aligned perfectly with the dates of the transfers, there were no extravagant purchases, no vacations, no indulgences, only payments to surgeons, pharmacies, and medical facilities. And I asked the defendant why he had not disclosed his crisis to his employer, and he answered with a trembling voice that pride and fear had silenced him, that he believed asking would lead to humiliation or dismissal, that in his mind he had only two choices: watch his wife deteriorate or act recklessly in hope of buying time. And that word hope lingered in the air heavier than any accusation. Intent does not erase wrongdoing, but it reveals character, and character is the silent testimony that no document can fully capture. So I found myself confronting a deeper question. Was this man driven by greed or by terror of loss? Was this premeditated exploitation or desperate misjudgment? And as murmurs filled the room, I lifted my gavel to restore order. And when it struck the bench, it cracked sharply, splitting in a way that startled everyone, including myself. And in that instant, the symbol of authority in my hand seemed to reflect a fracture between rigid enforcement and thoughtful judgment. And I called for a brief recess, not because the law was unclear, but because justice requires clarity of conscience as well as statute. Alone in my chambers, I considered the employer's pain and the employees affected by financial strain. I considered the precedent any leniency might set. But I also considered the wife whose life had been saved, and the man who stood before me not celebrating stolen wealth, but burdened by debt and remorse. And when I returned to the bench, I placed the broken gavel pieces before me and explained that while the defendant had undeniably violated the law and must face consequences, incarceration would not restore the employer's funds, nor necessarily serve the broader interests of justice. So I ordered full restitution under strict supervision, mandatory financial ethics counseling, substantial community service, and a probationary period with clear conditions that any further violation would result in severe penalties, emphasizing that mercy is not the absence of accountability, but the presence of proportion. And I looked directly at the defendant and told him that trust is rebuilt through action, not sympathy, and that this opportunity was a responsibility heavier than any prison sentence because it demanded daily integrity. And as his wife wept quietly in relief, I sensed that the courtroom understood the distinction being drawn between excusing behavior and recognizing humanity. Months later, progress reports confirmed consistent repayment and compliance, and years later, I received a letter stating that every dollar had been repaid, that he had undertaken additional work to accelerate restitution, and that he now counseled others facing financial hardship to seek lawful solutions before desperation clouded judgment. In reading his words of gratitude, I reflected on the cracked gavel now resting in my chambers as a reminder that justice must be firm yet flexible, principled yet compassionate, because the true mystery was never whether he broke the law. He did. But whether guilt should be measured solely by action without regard to motive or circumstance. And that is a question society continues to wrestle with, because if justice becomes purely mechanical, it risks becoming cold. And if it becomes purely emotional, it risks becoming chaotic. And the delicate balance between those extremes is where a judge must stand every single day, listening carefully, weighing not only evidence, but humanity, ensuring that the law protects the innocent, corrects the wrong, and whenever possible, restores rather than simply destroys. And that case remains with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. A reminder that behind every charge is a story, behind every file number is a family, and behind every act labeled guilty, there may exist a heart that acted not out of malice, but out of fear. And it is in recognizing that distinction that justice fulfills its highest purpose.